Two of the WNBA's biggest names, just weeks apart, said almost the exact same thing about the media covering their league. First it was Caitlin Clark. Now it's Sophie Cunningham. And the more you look at both moments side by side, the less this feels like a coincidence, and the more it feels like something players around this league have been sitting on for a while, waiting for the right moment to say out loud. Today we're going deep on this one. We'll break down exactly what Cunningham said and the context around it, how it connects word for word to what Clark said earlier this season, why this particular interview is only surfacing now, months after it actually happened, what it reveals about how modern sports media operates as a business, how this fits into Cunningham's larger role on this team, and why the fan reaction has been so much more divided than most people expected. There's a lot to get through, so let's start from the beginning. First, some context on who's talking here. Sophie Cunningham isn't a rookie trying to make a name for herself or someone speaking without understanding the weight of her words. She's been in this league for years. She came up through a program that already had her dealing with intense scrutiny, and she's built a reputation as one of the more outspoken, physical, and unapologetic personalities in the WNBA. When she talks about media pressure and locker room dynamics, she's speaking from years of experience being in exactly that kind of environment, not from the outside looking in. This season specifically, she's been playing alongside a roster that's under more national attention than almost any team in WNBA history. Every single game the Fever plays gets treated like a marquee event, whether it's actually a rivalry night or just a regular Tuesday on the schedule. That's the environment Cunningham was describing when she made these comments, and it's important context for understanding why she felt the need to say something in the first place. Now let's get into the actual moment. Cunningham was in a media session, fielding a question about the wave of distraction and outside noise that's followed this team pretty much all season. Instead of giving a safe, generic non-answer, which is what most players do in that spot, she used the moment to make a real point. She opened by talking about how good the basketball actually is right now, specifically pointing to her own team's offensive numbers, noting they've been putting together historic scoring stretches, game after game, back to back to back. She wasn't just deflecting toward basketball in a vague way. She was pointing at specific, measurable things happening on the court that she felt deserved more attention than they were getting. Then she pivoted into the actual criticism. In her words, all the WNBA media ever does is cover everything except basketball. She followed that up by essentially asking, rhetorically, what exactly is going on, given how much good basketball is happening that isn't getting the same level of coverage as off-court storylines. To her credit, she didn't stop there and just leave it as a blanket complaint. She clarified her position immediately. She said those other stories, the ones about players' personal lives, their personalities, their lives outside the sport, do have real value. She specifically said they help fans understand who players are as people beyond what happens on the court, and that there's nothing wrong with that kind of content existing. Her issue wasn't that those stories get told at all. Her issue was about where the priority sits. In her own words, the main thing has to stay the main thing. That distinction is the single most important part of everything she said, and it's also the part that gets lost the fastest once a clip like this starts circulating online. Cunningham was not standing up and attacking every reporter who covers the WNBA as one giant group. She drew a specific, intentional line between two very different categories of media. On one side, you've got major national outlets and general news organizations, the ones who only show up when a story crosses over from sports into something bigger, something that becomes a genuine news event outside the basketball world. She made clear she wasn't really talking about them, because covering major news stories when they happen is simply what those organizations exist to do. That's their job, and she doesn't fault them for doing it. On the other side, you've got dedicated WNBA beat media. These are the reporters and outlets whose entire job, day in and day out, is specifically covering this league. They're the ones who travel with teams, who show up to practices, who are supposed to be explaining the strategy, the matchups, the performances, the things that actually happen between the lines. Her frustration was aimed squarely at that second group, the ones whose entire professional responsibility is basketball, but who, in her assessment, have increasingly drifted away from actually doing that. She backed this up with something concrete rather than leaving it abstract. She specifically pointed to a particular head-to-head matchup between two players from a recent high-profile game, calling that battle phenomenal, and she called her own team's performance in that same game genuinely great. Her point was that these were the storylines that should have been dominating headlines afterward, the actual basketball, and instead they got buried underneath distraction and controversy that had nothing to do with what happened on the floor. Now here's where this moment connects to something much bigger than one press conference. Weeks before Cunningham said any of this, Caitlin Clark was asked a strikingly similar question during All-Star Weekend, and her answer lines up almost perfectly with what Cunningham would go on to say. Clark said that media and journalism carry a responsibility to tell stories accurately, and that a lot of the time, the people covering the league end up controlling and shaping the public narrative in ways that drift away from what's actually happening on the ground. She specifically said that gap, between the narrative being told and the reality she's living inside of, can be genuinely disorienting. She tied that directly to her own situation, being 24 years old, trying to help her team win a championship, while simultaneously being one of the most heavily covered athletes in the entire country, with every word and every headline scrutinized in a way most 24-year-olds never have to deal with. Put those two moments side by side and a clear pattern starts to emerge. Two players on the same team, at two different points in the same season, independently arrived at the same core message. That the coverage has strayed away from the basketball itself, and that the distance between what's actually happening on the court and what's being reported has grown wide enough that players are now saying something about it publicly, on the record, multiple times. Let's move into the timing question now, because this is honestly the part generating the most conversation among fans. The interview where Cunningham made these specific comments didn't happen recently at all. It happened back in February, months before the article covering it actually went live. That gap, sitting on an interview for that long and then choosing to release it right in the middle of the season, has raised a lot of eyebrows, and there are a couple of theories worth walking through carefully. I want to be upfront here that neither of these theories has been confirmed by ESPN or by anyone on Cunningham's team, so treat all of this as fan speculation, not established fact. The first and most straightforward explanation is simple attention timing. If a media outlet is sitting on a completed profile piece about a WNBA player, it makes far more strategic sense to release it during the season, when interest in the league is naturally at its highest and fans are actively consuming content every single day, rather than releasing it back in February during the off-season when overall engagement is much lower. On its own, that explanation could fully account for the delay without needing anything more complicated behind it. The second theory floating around is a bit more specific and has generated more debate. Some fans have pointed out that the article was published the exact same week that Cunningham's signature shoe was scheduled to launch. The theory here is that publishing a personal profile piece close to a major product release could function as a form of built-in promotion, generating buzz and personal interest right before the launch date. It's a reasonable theory on its face, because that kind of timing overlap between media coverage and product releases happens across professional sports fairly regularly. But again, and this is worth repeating clearly, there has been no actual confirmation from ESPN, from Cunningham herself, or from her representatives that this was the actual intent behind the publishing schedule. It remains one possible explanation among several that fans have floated, and it's worth keeping an open mind here rather than treating it as a settled fact. Beyond the timing debate itself, there's a bigger structural point buried underneath Cunningham's original criticism, and it's genuinely worth sitting with for a minute. Articles that simply recap games or break down basketball strategy typically do not generate anywhere near the same traffic as pieces built around controversy, conflict, or off-court drama. That's not a WNBA-specific problem. It's simply how digital sports media operates across the entire industry right now. When a story starts trending, when it generates real engagement and clicks, outlets naturally lean further into that direction because that is exactly what the numbers reward. Editors watch what's performing well in real time, and they ask their writers for more coverage of whatever that is. That reality creates a genuine tension sitting underneath Cunningham's entire argument. On one hand, she's right that a lot of coverage skews away from basketball and toward controversy. On the other hand, the individual reporters and outlets producing that coverage are frequently just responding to what their editors and their traffic numbers are actively telling them to prioritize. This isn't really about any single reporter being lazy, biased, or malicious. It's about an entire media ecosystem that is economically incentivized to chase whatever performs best, which more often than not is conflict rather than a clean breakdown of a pick and roll. Still, Cunningham's underlying point stands on its own regardless of the reasons behind it. If the coverage keeps skewing in that direction, it's completely fair for players to push back publicly and ask for that balance to shift back toward the actual game they're playing. The reaction to all of this has ended up being far more split than a lot of people expected going in. A noticeable portion of fans have accused Cunningham of being the one who effectively started this entire cycle of controversy in the first place, arguing that she doesn't have much room to complain about distraction given that her own comments have generated plenty of headlines before this. Others have pushed back hard against that framing, pointing out clearly that she was simply answering a question she was asked directly during a media session. She didn't manufacture the story, and she certainly didn't choose when it got published. ESPN conducted that interview and released it on their own schedule, months after the fact, and once the article went live publicly, the wave of reaction that followed was completely out of her hands at that point. What's been especially notable through all of this is that even some fans of her own team, people who would typically be firmly in her corner by default, have been divided on how they feel about her comments. That alone shows this isn't a simple, clean, us versus them situation. It's a genuinely mixed reaction, cutting across fan bases in ways that don't map neatly onto team loyalty at all. So where does all of this actually leave things? Two of the most talked about players in the entire league right now, playing for the exact same team, have both independently said, in their own words, weeks apart from one another, that the media conversation surrounding the WNBA has drifted away from the basketball itself and toward everything happening around it instead. Whether you personally think that's a completely fair critique of how this league is being covered right now, or whether you think it oversimplifies a media landscape that's genuinely more complicated than any single quote can fully capture, is clearly something fans are still actively arguing about in real time, and probably will be for a while. What do you think? Do you believe the timing of this article's release was intentional, tied to something like a product launch, or is that reading too much into what was probably just a normal publishing schedule? And more broadly, do you agree with Cunningham's criticism that WNBA media coverage has genuinely lost sight of the basketball itself? Drop your honest take in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you're new to this channel and you want more Caitlin Clark and Indiana Fever coverage just like this, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.